Well, hello everybody. It's good to see everybody here, at least here virtually, if you're watching this message. So we have been, for the last 10 weeks, walking our way through the book of Exodus. Today we are actually finishing that series. We're going to finish the book of Exodus. I'm sure everybody is super excited. And we're going to be starting something brand new next week. I haven't completely decided on what exactly it's going to be, but my hope and my prayer is that whatever it is, it will bless you and you'll be encouraged by what you hear and what you listen to as we continue to just make our way through this pandemic and have to do all these weird and strange things just to deal with how we're supposed to operate during this time. So the whole idea behind this series, this Exodus series, is that we are in the space between the promise and the fulfillment of the promise. We as Christians, this is where we are. So Jesus made a promise. He said, I'm going to come back one day, but right now I'm leaving. And so we're in that space between the promise for him to return and set all things right and bring us to be with him, and the actual fulfillment of that promise. And that's the exact place that the people of Israel are in the book of Exodus. They're in that space between the promised land, the great nation, the blessing to all nations. They're in that space between that promise and the fulfillment of that promise. And so we've been walking through the book of Exodus looking for lessons to learn in the wilderness. And the amazing thing that I think we spotted is that a lot of the lessons that they learned in the wilderness, we also need to learn in the wilderness. So last week we looked at the golden calf incident, and we asked the question, what does God do when he is betrayed? What does he do when we betray him? And that's the question that we tried to answer last week. This week we're going to finish up our series by looking at the previous chapters to the golden calf incident. And so these chapters are all about God's presence among his people. And that's what we're really going to focus on in this last lesson, is God's presence. So can you think of a time in life when presence is especially meaningful? Can you think of a moment like this? I think of times like joy, when there's a birth, when you have a special event, when there's a holiday, or when it's vacation time. Presence is important for all those things, right? Another great time when presence is especially meaningful is in times of triumph, right? When you graduate, when you receive an award, when you are honored for something. It's a great time when people come and attend that moment when they find out or when they get to celebrate with you a moment of triumph. Another time when presence is especially meaningful is in the midst of crisis. When there's a sickness, when there's a hospital stay. Now, of course, right now in the COVID pandemic, we cannot go to hospitals like what we used to do. But at least before that, and hopefully one day again, we will get to this point where when somebody is sick and very sick, that you show up at their hospital bed and you pray over them. A death is also a crisis when it's wonderful to have other people around you in that moment. But presence is not just meaningful, right? It also does a couple things. So presence provides insight. This is why we date, right? This is why we date, because when we date and spend time together, are in each other's presence, we learn and understand things about each other. We get insight. Friendship is the same way. Not only does presence provide insight, but it also builds relationship. In a world with FaceTime and Skype and Zoom and Facebook Messenger, we still understand how important presence is. And we understand that even more now when our physical presence has been limited, right? We can't be bodily present like we used to be present. And so we understand more than ever how important presence is and how important it is for relationship building. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 25, verses 31, or Exodus chapter 25 through chapter 31 in this lesson. And we're going to talk about presence, God's presence. So a quick reminder of what brought us to this point. So God goes into a covenant with his people. He says, I do. They say, we do. They have a covenant meal to seal the deal. And now it's time for God to move in with his people. So let's start reading in Exodus chapter 25, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to bring me their sacred offerings, except the contributions from all whose hearts are moved to offer them. And then we get a list of all the things that are going to be brought in. The precious metals, the threads, the clothes, the wood, the olive oil, the spices, and all the gemstones, all the things that need to be collected. And then verse 8. Have the people of Israel build me a holy sanctuary so I can live among them. You must build this tabernacle and its furnishings exactly according to the pattern that I will show you. And then God provides this kind of step-by-step pattern to follow. And kind of like, it's kind of like an extremely detailed instruction manual. Now, how many people like to read instruction manuals? I hate reading instruction manuals. However, every time I don't read the instruction manual and I try to put something together, I always mess it up. So it's actually really important to read the instruction manual. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and just highlight some of the main points in these chapters. So first of all, God talks about how to consecrate or to dedicate the priests. He also tells what they should be wearing. He talks about the furnishings in the tabernacle, the table, the lampstand, the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant. By the way, the Ark of the Covenant is God's throne chariot. Okay, most people don't realize that the Ark of the Covenant is actually the place where God is kind of sitting, right? So in the ancient world, you'd often have these slaves going along carrying a litter with the royal person sitting on that litter, and people would be, there'd be poles through the bottom of the throne, and these strong men would lift the deity or the king or the queen up. That's the idea with the Ark of the Covenant. Whenever the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, the idea was that they would meet with the presence of God in between those two cherubim, which were on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, on top of the throne chariot. And so then also God gave them recipes for the lampstand oil, the anointing oil, the incense for the tabernacle. He also talked to them about the courtyard, how big it's supposed to be, what's supposed to be in it, the altar, the bronze laver for washing, all these things. He even calls out certain people to do the work. In chapter 31, Bezalel and Oholiab have been filled with God's Spirit, he says, and they're supposed to do the work for the tabernacle. So I just, I know I paraphrased just a ton of scriptures there, and the question that you have to ask is, well, what does all that mean? What can we glean from this? And I'm sure that most of you, if you read this passage of scripture on your own, you might find it kind of boring. But I want to suggest just a few things and what we can glean from this passage. Excuse me, my nose itches and I feel like I'm going to sneeze. So I apologize if that comes out here in just a moment. So first, the tabernacle establishes a portable place of worship. Portable. A portable place of worship. You see, people in the wilderness, they're on the move. They won't stay in the same place for long. And after the building of the temple, they actually become less mobile. And if you remember, David's son, Solomon, builds a temple, and now the people of Israel are stuck in one place. They've got to stay in that one place. And if you think about it today, we today are also portable. Worship is on the move. We cannot be dependent upon a building. We realize that more now than ever. Right? We can't be dependent upon a building. And I love it that God has created a place, a portable place. See, God has them build a place with furniture and with smells, because of the incense and, all the things that are supposed to have certain smells. Because here's the thing, places and smells are important to humans. Have you ever been captured by a scent? You ever been captured by a scent? I can still think of, or actually, I shouldn't say I can think of it. I make my mom's homemade chicken noodle soup. That's one of the recipes that I've carried on from her. And whenever I make that chicken noodle soup and I smell that smell wafting through my home, I'm captured and brought back to Sunday afternoons after church when we would have company over and my mom would make her homemade chicken noodle soup and homemade bread, and we would eat with friends or family or people that we care about. And I'm brought back, I'm captured by that smell. And so God has them build a portable place of worship that will be consistent, right? It's not just going and worshiping wherever you are. It's about having a consistency, a portable place where worship can happen. Number two, the tabernacle came from the mind of the one who would inhabit it. Like that's really important. The golden calf that we read about last week came from the mind of human beings. The Israelites determined on their own that this is how the Lord is going to be remembered or identified in their midst. But God didn't want to dwell in an idol. Rather, he wanted to dwell in a tent, a dwelling place, not a statue, a tent. But I think probably the most important thing that this idea of the tabernacle should communicate to us is that the tabernacle symbolizes God's willingness to dwell with his people. So I mentioned this last week. There's not going to be any more climbing to meet God like in other ancient religions. God is coming to live with them, and he doesn't choose to enjoy the benefits of his power. He's not disconnected from his people. He's not disconnected from humanity. Rather he commits to the struggle of living among his people. He gives himself over to intimacy, not remoteness. You don't have to get his attention. You have it. This is what is being communicated by God moving in the tabernacle among his people. God is with his people, and he is for his people. See, it's such a powerful idea and just understanding of the God that we serve. You see, John, the gospel author, actually builds off of this idea in his first chapter of his gospel. He says this in John chapter 1, verse 14. He says, "So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only," his home, his tent among us. Jesus came down, made his home among us. He tabernacled, he tented among us. And let me tell you something, even though Jesus is no longer here, there is a new dwelling place. And Peter talks about this in his first letter, chapter 2 of 1 Peter. He says, "You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. And you," listen to this, "and you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple." This is amazingly powerful. All that was true about the tabernacle is now true of you and me. You are a portable place of worship. You are a living place of worship. And guess what? You came from the mind of the one who would inhabit you. And guess what? We symbolize God's willingness to dwell with his people. He dwells in. You see, God from the beginning has sought to dwell with his people, to be present among them. And now we, as the church, we are that portable dwelling place. You see, God has come down to live in us, and when we are baptized into Christ, his Spirit lives within us. It's not a controlling spirit, but instead it is a spirit that will reign in you only as much as you choose to submit to him. He will transform you if you invite him to transform you. And so my encouragement to all of us is, in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of just feeling alone, for many of us, we feel alone, we feel lost, to remember that God is present. He is in you. He is with you. He is committed to the struggle. He is tabernacling in you now because of Jesus Christ. So go out and just know that God is with you, even when you feel alone. Know that He is with you no matter what. Be blessed, church. Have a wonderful weekend.